Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to talk today. So I'm over here for a week, hosted by Dr. Shane McGuinness, who I believe is a fellow came over with Joe O'Sullivan, who sat there, who's recently started his PhD with me. And we're trying to find out from you all over this side what you do about peatlands here, so that we can take that knowledge back and think about what we can learn in the Scottish context, but also different geographical contexts. So I'm going to try and give you in the next 15 minutes until someone shuts me off a bit of a round the world in 4 peatlands, places that I've worked in the past but still working in a little bit, and then some new projects as well. But I hear that this is the 250th probably morning of the Earth Institute, which is really exciting. And there was meant to be a super duper speaker who couldn't make it, so you've got me in peatlands there, which is yeah. And so I was thinking, so paleoecology is my background. I've spent most of my PhD looking at fossil pollen to understand long-term ecological change in peatlands. So I thought, well, what might 250 coffee mornings represent in terms of peat accumulation? And so this is a peat core that a colleague of mine, Katie Ruku, took. It's about 20 centimetres long. And if we take the average peat accumulation rate across the world, so it varies obviously according to the ecology of vegetation that's created with peat, climate, etc. But 250 coffee mornings, I've been told they started in 2017, so we're edging towards 10 years. So that might be about a centimetre of peat that's accumulated during that period, which I think we can celebrate. We also need to think about how much peat we can lose during that time if we drain peatlands. So we could lose about the whole 20 centimetres during that same period, depending on where you are. In East Anglia, in the East Anglian Fens, so slightly different peatlands type, and they've been draining those peatlands for a long time. But I think one of the fastest loss rates is 2.5 centimetres a year. So let's celebrate the accumulation and think about how we prevent loss. And that's what my work tries to focus on. So the sort of overarching umbrella research questions that I do my work is, what are the key characteristics of peatlands in each place? What is their health as well? How do people interact with peatlands in different locations? And using that learning, how can we propose new ways or revise the ways that we're interacting with peatlands? And much of my work of late has been thinking about the impact of net zero policies on peatland management, because they're causing us to package up carbon into units to essentially get peatlands to pay for their own management, to keep that carbon in the ground rather than it being emitted from these ecosystems. So over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a really whistle-stop tour of 4 different peatland areas that I've worked in and still working in, and try and answer the questions of what peatlands do we find in each place, what condition are they in. These are very reductive answers to all of these questions, but just to give you an insight. How are people generally interacting with peatlands in these different places, and what might the future hold? What do we do about peatlands in these places? So I'm going to start with an overview of what's happening in Sarawak, one of the Malaysian states where I did my PhD. Then go over to Peru, the lowland Peruvian Amazon, where I did my postdoc with an interdisciplinary team there. Then think about Scotland, what's happening there, and that relates to Joe's work. And then the case of Rwanda, which is very interesting, where I've just got a PhD student who started working there. So Sarawak, this map shows you roughly where the peatlands are. In Sarawak, you mostly find dipterocarp-dominated peat swamp forests. I don't actually have a good picture of these peat swamp forests because it was really hard to find any that was still intact when I was there about 10, 15 years ago. You can kind of see them at the back of this photo, but much of to answer the second question, so we've got peat swamp forests here, large trees, sedges dominating these peat-forming environments. Condition-wise, a lot of these coastal peat swamp forests that form coastal peat domes are heavily degraded and or have disappeared, mostly for oil palm plantation development. So this map shows roughly the coincidence of oil palm plantations where these coastal peatlands are. When I was there, I think this was from about 2008, much of the coastal peatlands, you could see them being converted into oil palm plantations, so deforested, drained, converted. The first part of my PhD was looking at long-term ecological change in these peat swamp forests to understand, are these forests resilient to disturbance? Can we tell in the past whether peat swamp forest has come back after episodes of climatic change, climatic warming, drying, burning, people being in these areas? This is a pollen diagram. I don't know how many people have ever interacted with one. Don't worry about taking any big details in, but I thought I'd just show you what one looks like later of the paleontologist. The thing to take away from this is that the forests did recover in the past after incidents of burning, evidence of people in the landscape, changes. So with smaller scale disturbance, these forests demonstrated resilience. However, today, so thinking about human peatland interactions, most of those coastal peat swamp forests have been deforested and converted into drainage-based agriculture. And when I carried out some interviews with small-scale farmers through to plantation managers, government officials, they all said that the value of these peatland areas is that they're a land asset that can be drained for agriculture in the future. So they're a source of revenue through agriculture when they're drained. Roll on 15 years, last October, I just asked Joe how to pronounce it, the Taoiseach equivalent, the Prime Minister of Sarawak, launched their net zero policy, big fanfare. So Sarawak is now working towards reducing emissions. They actually say that they're a net zero state, oh no, net negative state because of the forests that they have. I'm thinking, think more about that maybe, but peatlands are part of their net zero plan. They have to do something about their peatlands. They're named on all of the official reporting as nature-based solutions, as they are in many places of the parts of the world now. And you can't read it, but it says peatland rehabilitation is what they're going to focus on. So what do they do with their peatlands now? They have to think about rehabilitating them rather than restoring them to former peat swamp forests. So what do they do about their peatlands in Sarawak? They're coming up with this peatland rehabilitation plan and thinking about, well, how do we use these now heavily degraded, compacted, in some cases, areas that are maybe below sea level. So it's a lot of work needs to be done in that state. So that's Sarawak. Moving on to the Peruvian Amazon. So I did my postdoc research there, funded by the Legal Human Trust and Scottish Funding Council, on a project, really interdisciplinary project led by Katie Ruku, it's based in St Andrews. So the peatlands that you find in the lowland Peruvian Amazon, there are various different types of peat-forming ecosystems, one of which are these palm-dominated peat swamp forests. The main palm is Mauritia flexuosa that you can see here. This is another type of peat-forming ecosystem called, we call it an open peatland. So you even find sphagnum in these peatlands, which is really cool. So they're different kinds of mostly forested, sometimes open peatlands that you find in this area that floods a lot every year. Condition-wise, these peatlands are quite a long way from urban areas, quite difficult to get to. You take a boat from an urban area for about 10 hours to get to some of these peatland areas where you find very sparsely populated communities. So they're actually being used mostly in a sustainable way. And a principal use of these peatlands is to extract the aguaje fruit, known as Mauritia, from these Mauritia flexuosa plants that you find in these peatful forests. So mostly it's sustainable use, but actually as populations grew and the money economy reached some of these communities, they started to harvest these fruits in an unsustainable way. And this map here shows you how the proportion of male to female palm individuals has become uneven. So the fruits are found on the female individuals, and it's much easier to just cut down a female to get the fruits which are at the top of the palm than it is to climb the palm and then cut the fruits. So we were seeing, and this was some research done led by some people in the Institute of Research Institute in the Peruvian Amazon, with some colleagues of mine at St Andrews, looking at this changing ratio between the male and female palms. And we're finding in the more accessible areas closer to some of the urban centres that this ratio is getting really skewed, which is no good for peat formation, for the ecology of these ecosystems. So this photo of somebody actually climbing a palm with assistance from governments, NGOs, and other kind of groups that are coming into these communities to help them learn how to climb the palms rather than to cut them down, is happening in this area, a community called Vente de Enero that we worked in. So in terms of these peatlands, peat forming ecosystems, sustainable harvesting is very possible, and there's now support in the communities where they have got a skewed ratio between the palms, to think about alternative ways of harvesting these fruits that lead to sustainable use and peatland health. That's Peruvian Amazon. Scotland. This is a map of roughly where the peat soils, organic root soils, are in Scotland. 25%, about 25% of Scotland is covered in peat soils, organic root soils. 23% of that, roughly, are blanket bogs. I've got a lot of blanket bogs there. This is one of them. This is an area of supposedly restored peatlands in a big estate called the Peru estate that the University of St Andrews has a relationship with, where Joe will be working predominantly. So peatland types, mostly blanket bog, condition, all sorts of conditions, really, depending on peatland interactions in particular places. So we have a lot of mown or burnt peatlands on grouse shooting estates, especially in the central belt and lower highlands of Scotland. Then we have a lot of peat cutting happening still in the Western Isles, the Outer Hebrides. And a project that I did there was looking partly at why are people still cutting, and energy security, cost of energy. So living prices is a big factor that's taken people back to peat cutting in these more marginal areas, as we might call them. And there's a bit more information in that paper there. And then overgrazing and by sheep, but also trampling and overgrazing by deer is a big issue, and it's something that Joe might look into, what impacts is grazing having on restoration success. You can't really see, but there's sort of a migration happening down in this valley. I was on a walk and saw so many deer running across this area of really degraded peat, which was interesting. So Joe is going to hopefully help to contribute towards our understanding of what does long-term successful ecological restoration look like in peatlands. And another project also funded by this NetGain Doctoral Focal Award that the UK Research and Innovation Council are funding, is going to be looking at what does just restoration look like, or what does restoration look like after just transition in some of these communities where peat is still a really important energy source for them. Which leads on to the last peatland, Rwanda. So I got interested in Rwanda when I heard about these peat-fired power stations being built in the very recent past. So one was opened in 2021. I think there were 2 peat-fired power stations that have recently been opened in Rwanda. So where are the peatlands? They're mostly in the east of the country, but also in the centre there. And you find peatlands in the form of valley peats. So a lot of Rwanda is quite hilly, but there are these quite deep river valleys where peat has been accumulating. What condition is it in? This map here shows the organic soils where there's very low degradation. Apologies for these maps aren't great, but the Greifswald Meyer Centre, one of the projects that they're doing with the Global Peatlands Initiative is to create better maps. We don't have great maps. Peatlands are in Rwanda at the moment. So on the east, where there's a national park, it's quite well preserved. But in the centre, where we've got higher population density, a lot of the peatlands are degraded. This interesting situation of peat-fired power stations just starting to be developed in Rwanda is but from a human peatland interaction perspective, it's very interesting to try and understand more about what's going on there. So 20% of the electricity production within the country, domestic electricity supply, is touted to come from these peat-fired power stations at the moment and into the future. But there are all sorts of difficulties with reaching that 20%, which I won't go into now. So that's one big factor that needs to be thought about when thinking about what Rwanda does with its peatlands, especially under net zero, because about 25 to 50% of the estimate at the moment of Rwanda's emissions are coming from its peatlands. So it's an awful lot. Human peatland interactions then, apart from its energy production, some of the valley peats are being protected. And this is an area called Rugezi in the north of the country, right next to a large dam where hydro is generated. So this peatland is protected in part to pick up water source for that dam, the electricity from it. But a lot of those valley peats are used for subsistence agriculture. And this is a photo that my PhD student took when he was out in Rwanda in January, I think, of this year. So one of the questions that we have is, well, what role do these valley peats play for domestic food security? And what role does that small-scale food production have on the condition of, is this bad for peatlands or not, compared to, for example, harvesting for electricity production? And if these people can't grow their food in these areas, then where will they grow their food? So my student will be looking at some of these questions. You know, what role do peatlands play in food security and Rwanda's sustainable future? So that was a real whistle-stop tour. Sarawak, thinking about peatland rehabilitation, what do they do there? How can we support sustainable use of the resources coming from peat swamp forests in Peru? What does successful restoration look like? How do we get there in Scotland? And Rwanda, how do we support them to understand more about the role that peatlands play within the country? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.